June 4, 1942. The sun rises pale over the endless blue of the Pacific. On the bridge of the Japanese carrier Akagi, the air smells faintly of oil, salt, and morning steel. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands still, eyes fixed on the horizon where nothing yet moves. Around him, officers murmur in low voices, confident, disciplined, assured. The Imperial Navy has never lost a naval battle in modern history. Their carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu slice through the waves like floating fortresses. They believe the Americans are retreating, weak, disorganized. The very idea that these cumbersome floating barns could threaten Japan's fleet seems almost laughable. But then, somewhere in the distance, a lookout shouts. Faint black dots appear against the rising sun. At first they seem like dust on the glass. Then they multiply a swarm of aircraft, diving out of the light. Within minutes, the still morning becomes an inferno of fire, smoke, and disbelief. The floating barns have come hunting. In the early months of 1942, Japan stood at the height of its imperial power. From the jungles of Burma to the reefs of the Philippines, the rising sun stretched across half the Pacific. Every fleet it faced, British, Dutch, American, had been swept aside with alarming speed. The Imperial Navy had rewritten the rules of naval warfare, launching devastating carrier raids from thousands of miles away. Pearl Harbor had not only crippled the U.S., the Pacific Fleet had stunned the world. 6 Japanese carriers had sailed undetected across the ocean and struck with mechanical precision, destroying battleships and killing over 2,000 sailors. It was an operation of daring, technology, and calculation. To Japan's high command, it confirmed what they already believed. No Western Navy could match Japanese skill or discipline at sea. Yet, within that triumph lay the seeds of overconfidence. For decades before Pearl Harbor, Japan's naval philosophy had been built on a single idea, that decisive battles were won by big guns. Battleships, not carriers, were seen as the heart of power. Carriers were considered vulnerable, auxiliary platforms useful for reconnaissance or limited strikes, but hardly decisive tools of war. Their flight decks were made of wood, their hulls thinner than steel giants like the Yamato and Nagato. Among traditionalists in the Imperial Navy, they earned a mocking nickname, Dobutsu no Yado, the floating barns. The Americans, they believed, had embraced this weakness even further. Their carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, Hornet, and Yorktown, were bulky, slow to maneuver, and often carried fewer planes than Japanese vessels. Japanese intelligence described them as inefficient, overbuilt, and unsuited for the fast, concentrated warfare that Yamamoto's admirals preferred. So when the U.S. lost its battleships at Pearl Harbor, many Japanese officers quietly celebrated. "The Americans have lost their spine," one naval observer wrote in his diary. "They will not fight again for years." But the Americans did not collapse. In the months that followed, something unexpected began to happen. Despite catastrophic losses, the U.S. Navy reorganized faster than Japan ever imagined. Carriers that survived Pearl Harbor became mobile strike groups, repositioned across the Pacific. New aircraft like the SBD Dauntless dive bomber and the TBD Devastator torpedo plane were being used in ways no doctrine had anticipated. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, made a bold decision. The carrier, not the battleship, would now lead America's war at sea. It was a gamble born of necessity. With most of its capital ships destroyed or damaged, the U.S. Navy had little choice. But from that limitation came innovation. Task forces centered around carriers became self-contained mobile fleets, protected by cruisers and destroyers, coordinated through radio and radar. Pilots trained relentlessly in coordinated strikes, torpedo bombers attacking from low altitude while dive bombers plunged from the clouds. In April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Americans struck back in a daring raid led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. 16 B-25 bombers launched from the deck of the USS Hornet, striking Tokyo itself. The material damage was minimal, but the psychological effect was enormous. For the first time, Japanese civilians felt the war reach their homeland. Yamamoto's pride was wounded. To him, the raid was an insult proof that the Americans were neither broken nor afraid. "We must crush their carriers," he told his staff. "Only then will they lose the will to fight." From that moment, Japan's naval command began planning an operation meant to destroy the remaining U.S. carriers once and for all. The target would be a small remote atoll in the Central Pacific, a place of no real importance on its own. But strategically, it lay astride the sea routes between Hawaii and Asia. The Americans called it Midway, and as Japan's massive armada set sail for it, their confidence was absolute. The floating barns they had once dismissed were about to prove just how wrong that confidence would be. By late May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing for what it believed would be its crowning triumph. The operation that would end America's naval presence in the Pacific. The plan was both complex and daring. A massive strike to seize Midway Atoll, lure the remaining American carriers into battle, and annihilate them in one decisive blow. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, envisioned a trap elegant in its simplicity. Japan's fleet would move in multiple formations, masking their true strength. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north, while the main carrier force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would strike Midway directly. Once the U.S. carriers responded, they would find themselves outnumbered and encircled. On paper, it was flawless, but Yamamoto's plan depended on one crucial assumption that the Americans were blind. They weren't. At Pearl Harbor, deep in the basement of a nondescript building, a small group of cryptanalysts had been working around the clock to break the Japanese Navy's code, known as JN-25. The team, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, operated under the codename Station Hypo. For months, they had been intercepting fragments of Japanese communications-coded weather reports, logistics schedules, reconnaissance plans, and piecing them together like an enormous puzzle. In early May, they began seeing repeated references to a target called AF. Japan's messages spoke of preparations, fuel requirements, and supply chains all pointing toward a major operation. Rochefort suspected AF meant Midway. But in war, suspicion wasn't enough, so the Americans devised a clever test. Midway was instructed to broadcast an unencrypted message stating that its water desalination plant had broken down. Within 24 hours, Japanese radio operators sent back a report. AF is short on fresh water. It was the confirmation Rochefort needed. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew exactly where and when Japan would strike, while Japan's fleet, 4 of its best carriers, 2 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft steamed east toward Midway. The Americans quietly prepared their ambush. 3 carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown were gathered north of the atoll. Their combined air wings numbered barely 230 planes, far fewer than the Japanese armada. Yet Nimitz had 2 advantages Yamamoto did not: intelligence and surprise. On June 3rd, the first Japanese aircraft appeared over Midway. They unleashed waves of bombs and torpedoes against the island's defenses, blackening the sky with smoke. The atoll's small garrison fought back with anti-aircraft fire, but their airstrip was shredded within hours. From the deck of the Akagi, Nagumo observed the attack's progress. His scouts reported damage inflicted, but no sign of American carriers. To him, it confirmed what he expected: the enemy was hiding, still broken, afraid to engage directly. But then, a single radio message changed everything. One of his reconnaissance planes, delayed in launching due to maintenance, suddenly spotted something on the horizon. 10 ships, believed to be enemy. Nagumo hesitated. Were they warships? Transports? A decoy? He had to make a choice: rearm his planes with torpedoes for naval attack or continue bombing Midway to ensure its destruction. He ordered the bombers rearmed. It was a decision that would cost him his fleet. Far to the northeast, aboard the USS Enterprise, American pilots waited inside their cockpits. Engines idled, propellers thumped like distant drums. They had been briefed that morning. Japan's main carriers were located. Their mission destroyed them before they could strike again. The U.S. fleet launched wave after wave of aircraft. Torpedo squadrons, dive bombers, and fighters fanned out into the vast Pacific sky. Many would not return, but among those pilots was a sense of resolve to finish what began at Pearl Harbor. What the Japanese called floating barns were about to become floating predators. And within hours, the balance of the Pacific would shift forever. The Battle of Midway was not won by brute strength or sheer numbers. It was won by technology, timing, and tactical imagination, a clash between an empire still bound to tradition and a nation forced to innovate through desperation. Japan entered the war with the most advanced carrier force in the world. Its aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi A6M0, were fast, agile, and deadly. The Zero's unmatched maneuverability had given Japanese pilots an aura of invincibility during the first 6 months of the Pacific War. Their naval aviation doctrine, refined since the 1930s, emphasized coordination, precision, and aggressive offense. But that very success blinded them. The Imperial Navy failed to innovate beyond its early victories. While Japanese engineers produced beautifully designed machines, their military leadership underestimated the pace of American adaptation. The United States, meanwhile, treated every defeat as a laboratory. The Navy's engineers and tacticians studied the failures at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and even earlier raids. They examined how to strengthen carrier decks, improve fire suppression, and coordinate airstrikes more effectively. At Midway, this evolution bore fruit. The USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown were equipped with improved radar systems, allowing commanders to track enemy movements even beyond visual range, an edge Japan didn't yet possess. The Americans also employed newly developed hydraulic catapults that could launch fully loaded planes faster, enabling quicker strike cycles. But the most decisive innovation was not on the carriers. It was in the aircraft themselves. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, considered outdated before the war, became the weapon that turned the tide. Slow compared to Japanese fighters, it compensated with rugged construction, long range, and most importantly, precision. The Dauntless could release its 1,000-pound bomb from a vertical dive, striking a target within a few meters. Against carriers packed with fuel lines and munitions, that accuracy was lethal. The Americans didn't just fly these planes, they turned them into surgical instruments. If technology gave the Americans new tools, tactics gave them a new kind of warfare. Before Midway, naval combat was still imagined as a duel of ships exchanging fire across the horizon, but the Pacific had changed that forever. The true battle was now fought by pilot men who might never see the ships they destroyed. At the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, both sides had launched air attacks without ever sighting each other's fleets directly. Midway would refine that new reality into a devastating art form. Admiral Nimitz and his field commanders, Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, understood something. Yamamoto did not. Speed and timing now outweighed size and range. A well-coordinated airstrike, launched at the right moment, could neutralize an entire fleet. On the morning of June 4th, that theory was tested. The first U.S. waves to reach Nagumo's fleet were torpedo squadrons, slow, underprotected, flying at low altitude. They attacked with bravery bordering on suicidal. Japanese Zeros shredded them apart. Squadron after squadron was wiped out. Their torpedoes missed or failed to detonate. But their sacrifice achieved something extraordinary. While the Zeros swooped low to finish off the torpedo planes, the sky above the Japanese carriers was momentarily unguarded. That gap of a few minutes of unprotected airspace would become the most consequential window in modern naval history. At precisely 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived. Descending through sunlight and cloud, they found the Japanese carriers' fully exposed decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs, fuel lines, and ammunition covered every surface. The dauntless pilots rolled into steep dives. One described the moment as falling through glass toward hell. Within seconds, the sky erupted in fire. A single bomb pierced the Kaga's flight deck, detonating near the hangar. Another struck the Akagi amidships, igniting aviation fuel and turning the vessel into a rolling furnace. The Soryu was hit almost simultaneously, engulfed in flame before its crew even realized what had happened. 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were destroyed in less than 5 minutes. It wasn't luck. It was the execution of a new kind of warfare, one born from adaptation, intelligence, and sacrifice. The Japanese had been fighting yesterday's war with tomorrow's tools. The Americans, fighting for survival, had rewritten the rule book entirely. The ocean below burned with floating debris and oil slicks that stretched for miles. But for the men in the sky, the battle was far from over. What had begun as a test of machines and timing was now transforming into a brutal contest of endurance. Will and human cost, a story written in smoke and courage. In war, Technology may decide battles, but men decide history. At Midway, courage wasn't abstract. It had names, faces, and final moments. For the young American pilots launching from decks barely long enough to take off, there was no illusion of survival. Many had less than a year of flight experience. Some had never landed on a carrier before combat. They climbed into their cockpits knowing the odds, knowing they would likely never return. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying obsolete TBD Devastators from the USS Hornet, made their attack run without fighter cover. One by one, their planes were torn apart by Japanese Zeros. Out of 15 aircraft, only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, who watched from the water as the Japanese fleet continued its advance. Their mission failed tactically, but succeeded in something deeper. It drew every Japanese fighter low, clearing the skies for the dive bombers that would strike minutes later. Gay's testimony years later was calm and reflective. "We didn't die for nothing. We died buying time. On both sides, bravery was absolute. Japanese deck crews fought the inferno with bare hands, tossing burning bombs overboard. Pilots launched even as their carriers burned beneath them. They were men bound by duty, trained to obey, not to question. The difference lay not in courage, but in command. Leadership defined Midway as much as weaponry. On one side stood Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, whose quiet precision masked a mind built for calculated risk. On the other hand, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, perhaps the most brilliant strategist Japan ever produced, was a man who had studied in America and once admired its industry. Both understood that Midway would decide the Pacific. But their styles could not have been more different. Nimitz delegated authority, trusting subordinates like Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher to make decisions in real time. His command philosophy was pragmatic. Act on the best information available and trust your people to adapt. In contrast, Yamamoto's plan was an intricate clockwork mechanism, dependent on perfect timing, secrecy, and obedience. When unforeseen events disrupted the order of the delayed scout plane, the split carrier forces, the rearming confusion aboard Akagi, the Japanese system froze. Their doctrine, brilliant in theory, left no room for improvisation. Meanwhile, Nimitz's gamble of placing his carriers north of Midway based on a codebreaker's hunch showed both audacity and faith. He understood the advantage of surprise and the power of intelligence. His calm directive to Spruance before the battle reflected his style. "You know the enemy plan. Execute." That freedom to adapt to change the playbook mid-battle proved decisive. As flames consumed the Kaga and Soryu, Spruance resisted the temptation to chase blindly. He preserved his forces, rotated squadrons, and prepared for counterattacks. His composure amid chaos stood in sharp contrast to the rigid hierarchy aboard the Japanese flagship, where minutes were lost in hesitation and disbelief. For Japan's naval command, Midway was more than a defeat. It was a shattering of identity. Since 1905, when Japan's fleet annihilated the Russians at Tsushima, the nation had believed in its divine destiny at sea. Every officer in the Imperial Navy had grown up under that legend. The invincible fleet, guided by superior spirit and discipline, at Midway, that belief died in fire. Admiral Nagumo's bridge, once filled with quiet confidence, descended into silence as word spread that the Akagi was lost. Survivors later recalled his face, pale and expressionless, staring at the black smoke that had once been Japan's pride. Some crewmen wept openly. Others stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had happened. In a single morning, decades of tradition and arrogance were erased. The floating barns they had mocked, those ungainly American carriers, had turned out to be more than machines. They were symbols of adaptation, fueled not by spirit but by relentless practicality. For the Americans, the psychological transformation ran in the opposite direction. Pearl Harbor had been a humiliation. Midway became redemption. Every pilot who returned to the deck carried not just victory but vindication. They had proven that courage could learn and that resilience could outthink superiority. By nightfall, the Pacific was no longer Japan's domain. The Emperor's fleet had been humbled by an enemy at once considered unworthy of fear. And as the fires of Midway burned into the ocean's darkness, both nations understood the war had entered a new phase. One side would fight to preserve what it had lost, the other to finish what it had begun. The morning of June 4, 1942, began with confidence aboard the Japanese carriers. By 9 a.m., The first wave of bombers had returned from their strike on Midway Island. The attack was only partially successful. Fuel tanks destroyed, airfields damaged, but not the annihilation Nagumo wanted. He ordered his planes rearmed for a second strike, this time to finish the island's defenses. Below decks, armorers and mechanics worked feverishly. Aircraft were rolled back into position, torpedoes refitted, and bomb racks adjusted. Fuel lines snaked across the hangars. The air was thick with fumes and sweat. The orderlies hurried, unaware that their efficiency was building the perfect trap. Then came the report that changed everything. Enemy ships sighted, bearing 10 degrees east. It was a scout plane from the cruiser Tone, delayed in its launch that morning by a single thread that unraveled Japan's grand design. Nagumo hesitated. He had two choices: launch immediately with planes armed for land targets, or take the time to rearm them for an anti-ship attack. To strike with half-prepared aircraft would mean fewer hits. To delay meant vulnerability if the Americans attacked first. He chose delay. By the time his carriers began rearming again, the Americans were already in the air. From the USS Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, waves of planes had launched in staggered formations, torpedo squadrons flying low, dive bombers climbing high. The sky above the Pacific was soon filled with aircraft, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. The first to arrive were the torpedo bombers Brave, doomed and unprotected. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet came in low and straight, their TBD Devastators crawling toward the enemy at barely 200 miles per hour. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol Elite Zero fighters dove upon them mercilessly. In minutes, the sky became a massacre. Flames and debris fell into the sea like rain. Every plane of the squadron was shot down. None scored a hit. Moments later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise tried the same run and met the same fate. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. Out of 41 torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 6 returned, but their deaths had a consequence no one could have planned. The Zeros, drawn low in pursuit, left the skies above the Japanese fleet unguarded. At 10:22 a.m., the dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived, not in perfect formation, not by grand strategy, but by the fragile luck of timing and endurance. After hours of searching, running low on fuel, they stumbled upon the Japanese carriers at the very moment when their decks were most vulnerable. What they saw below defied belief. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, lay exposed, flight decks crammed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes sat out in the open. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Commander Clarence McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's bombers, banked his plane sharply and gave the order to attack. The first Dauntless went into a steep dive, screaming downward at nearly 275 miles per hour. Bombs fell true, whistling through the air. 1,000 pounds of steel and explosive hit the Kaga's deck amidships, and the ship erupted in fire. Seconds later, more bombs struck the Akagi and Soryu. Fuel lines ignited like fuses. The blast waves tore open hangars, flinging aircraft into the sea. One Japanese officer later recalled, "The ship was burning from bow to stern. It was as if the sun itself had fallen upon us." Within minutes, all 3 carriers were ablaze. Crews tried desperately to fight the fires, but the heat was impossible to contain. The inferno spread to ammunition stores. Secondary explosions tore through the hulls, sending black smoke thousands of feet into the air. Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the proud Akagi, was mortally wounded. He ordered his staff to abandon ship. At 10:46 a.m., the order to scuttle her was given. 3 of Japan's elite carriers and the very instruments of Pearl Harbor were now floating wrecks. From his command post, Admiral Yamamoto received the reports with disbelief. The entire offensive, built on precision and timing, had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. Still, hope remained that one carrier, the Hiryu, was untouched. Her decks were clear, her planes armed. The counterattack would now fall to her. The sun was still high, the sea still burning. What followed would test both fleets to their breaking point, a final exchange of fury and survival that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The Japanese carrier Hiryu now stood alone against the Pacific. Her decks were slick with oil and seawater, the air around her filled with the drifting smoke of her fallen sisters. Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, commanding Hiryu, refused to surrender to despair. His voice cut through the tension. "Prepare the planes. We attack at once." Within minutes, 20 dive bombers roared into the air, the last breath of the once mighty Kido Butai. Their target, the USS Yorktown, whose location had been fixed by radio intercepts. High above the waves, the Japanese pilots flew with grim precision. The sea below shimmered silver in the midday sun, a deceptive calm beneath the storm about to unfold. At 12:20 p.m., they sighted their prey. The Yorktown steamed steadily forward, her flight deck alive with returning planes and refueling crews. The alarm came too late. Enemy dive bombers are incoming, sirens wailed. The ship's guns opened up, tracer rounds clawing the sky. But the attackers came in fast, nearly vertical, their Aichi D3A valves slicing through the flak like falling knives. The first bomb smashed through the flight deck, detonating below in a white-orange flash. Another hit near the island, and a third exploded deep in the hangar, igniting fuel lines. Flames rolled through the interior decks. Within minutes, the Yorktown was crippled, listing her engines dead. Yet even in chaos, her crew refused to abandon ship. Damage control parties fought the fires, pumping water, sealing compartments, saving what they could. Their discipline drilled into them since before Pearl Harbor kept the ship afloat. By 2 p.m., the flames were subdued. Yorktown was wounded, but alive. Then came the second wave. At 3:30 p.m., Hiryu's torpedo bombers found her again. Flying low, they split into 2 attack runs, crossing from opposite sides. The Yorktown's gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, hitting several planes but not enough. 2 torpedoes slammed into her starboard side in quick succession. The ship shuddered violently. Power failed. The list worsened to 26 degrees. Captain Elliot Buckmaster finally gave the order. Abandon ship. Men poured over the rails into the oily sea, lifeboats and rafts spreading in every direction. From above, the Hiryu's pilots could see the great carrier fading into the waves, her flight deck awash. For the first time that day, the Japanese believed they had balanced the scales, but vengeance was coming. American reconnaissance planes had traced Hiryu's position through her radio transmissions. At 4:45 p.m., a squadron of dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and the reeling Yorktown located her, the last surviving Japanese carrier. She was maneuvering at full speed, launching the last of her fighters. The sea around her glimmered gold in the late sun. It was almost beautiful until the bombers dove. The first bomb struck amidships. The second tore through the forward hangar. The third hit aft, detonating near the fuel stores. Fire swept across the deck in sheets. The heat was blinding. Ammunition began to cook off. By 5:10 p.m., Hiryu was engulfed in flames, her flight deck collapsing inward. Admiral Yamaguchi stood on the bridge, face calm in the orange light. He refused evacuation, choosing to die with his ship. "Let us sink together," he told his staff. At 8:20 p.m., Hiryu was abandoned by her surviving crew. By dawn, she slipped beneath the waves, joining the burning hulks of her sister ships. In less than a single day, Japan had lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with over 250 aircraft and many of her most experienced naval aviators. The core of the Imperial Navy's striking arm, the same force that had ravaged Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific, was gone. American losses were painful but limited. 1 carrier, the Yorktown, later sunk by a submarine, and 147 aircraft. But in strategic terms, it was a complete reversal of power. The Japanese fleet, once the hunter, was now the hunted. The waters of Midway were littered with oil, debris, and the bodies of men who only hours before had believed themselves invincible. From the air, the scene looked surreal. The vast Pacific, calm and endless, scarred by 4 black columns of smoke rising from the sea. The floating barns the Admirals had mocked had not only survived, they had erased an empire's pride in a single afternoon. By nightfall, the Pacific was silent again except for the faint crackle of burning ships and the groaning of twisted steel. Midway was over, but its echoes would reshape the war and the men who fought it forever. The dawn after Midway was eerily calm. The sea that had raged with explosions and burning fuel now stretched empty and silent, save for drifting wreckage and oil slicks spreading like bruises across the water. Seagulls circled the debris, and the bodies of Japanese sailors floated among twisted fragments of their great war machines. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan was not celebrating. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard his distant flagship Yamato, received the first fragmented reports with disbelief. One carrier lost, then two, then four. Each new transmission deepened the silence on his bridge until even the ship's engines seemed to fade beneath the weight of the news. Yamamoto, the man who had orchestrated the lightning victory at Pearl Harbor, now faced the unthinkable. Total defeat. He had warned his superiors years before. "I can run wild for 6 months after that. I can guarantee nothing." Midway had come almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prophecy had come true. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy Ministry tried to contain the disaster. The press was told only that a fierce engagement had occurred near Midway and that some damage had been sustained. But whispers spread through the ranks. 4 carriers gone, thousands dead, the best pilots lost. The once invincible Kido Butai, symbol of Japanese dominance, had ceased to exist. For Japan, the loss was more than ships and planes. It was a psychological fracture. The nation's military ethos was built on the idea of divine invincibility, that the emperor's warriors could not be defeated by mere men. But at Midway, that illusion shattered. Pilots who had trained for years, officers who had believed their enemies inferior, had been erased in hours. The Imperial Navy's most experienced carrier air crews, the elite who had struck Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Ceylon, were gone forever. Replacing ships was hard. Replacing men like them was impossible. In contrast, the American victory electrified Washington. When Admiral Chester Nimitz received confirmation that all 4 Japanese carriers were burning, he allowed himself a rare smile. His coded message to Washington was brief and understated. AF appears to have been effectively relieved. But inside naval headquarters, the reaction was one of shock and relief. The U.S. Navy had been fighting a losing battle since December 1941, retreating across the Pacific, desperate to hold the line. Now, against overwhelming odds, it had turned the tide. Newspapers the next morning announced the victory in cautious tones. Many Americans had never heard of Midway Atoll before that week. But by the time the headlines spread across the country, U.S. Navy wins great victory in Pacific, the name became synonymous with redemption. For the sailors who had fought there, the triumph was bittersweet. Hundreds of aviators and deck crews never returned. Entire squadrons had been wiped out, their planes seen one last time disappearing into the Pacific haze. The sea claimed them quietly, without glory or fanfare. Yet their sacrifice had changed everything. From a strategic standpoint, Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan's dream of expanding its empire eastward to Hawaii, perhaps even to the American mainland, was now impossible. With its carrier force crippled, Japan could no longer launch major offensive operations. The United States, meanwhile, gained momentum. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy held the initiative. American industry began producing carriers and aircraft at a staggering rate, faster than Japan could replace its losses. In the months following Midway, a quiet but irreversible shift occurred. Japan began reacting to America, not the other way around. And yet, for those who survived the battle on both sides, the victory and defeat carried a human weight that went beyond strategy. Japanese sailors, rescued from the burning seas, wept openly when they learned how many of their comrades were gone. American pilots, many barely in their 20s, returned to their carriers in silence, haunted by the faces of friends who hadn't made it back. The Pacific was wide enough to hold their triumphs and their grief alike. By the time night fell again on June 5, 1942, the waves had swallowed the last of Japan's burning carriers. The Pacific had kept its secret. But history had already been rewritten, not in Tokyo or Washington, but in the endless blue between them. In the months that followed Midway, the full magnitude of Japan's loss began to surface not in the headlines, but in the quiet halls of the Imperial Navy and the empty airfields of the home islands. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. But what truly broke Japan's back was the loss of its pilots, the men whose skill and experience had taken a decade to forge. The survivors of the battle were too few to rebuild an elite air corps. Training schools accelerated their programs, cutting flight hours and lowering standards. Young recruits were sent into combat with less than a quarter of the experience their predecessors had at the start of the war. The result was a slow, invisible collapse, one that wouldn't fully reveal itself until the skies over the Marianas and the Philippines 2 years later, when Japan's air arm would be annihilated again, this time for good. Inside Tokyo's naval headquarters, Admiral Yamamoto was devastated but pragmatic. He knew Japan could no longer match American industry. In his private reflections, he admitted that Midway had shifted the war's balance permanently. Still, he resolved to fight on, hoping to buy time through attrition and psychological warfare. But Yamamoto's days were numbered. Less than a year later, in April 1943, American code breakers once again intercepted Japanese communications, this time detailing the Admirals' inspection flight across the Solomon Islands. U.S. Army P-38 fighters ambushed his transport plane. Yamamoto was killed instantly. The man who had warned Japan against a long war with America was now its most symbolic casualty, proof of how the very intelligence that saved Midway had evolved into a weapon of its own. In contrast, the U.S. Navy emerged from Midway transformed. Before June 1942, America's naval doctrine still clung to battleships as the centerpiece of sea power. After Midway, that belief was dead. The aircraft carrier, once dismissed as a floating experiment or barn with wings, was now the new king of the ocean. Every major U.S. naval shipyard turned its focus toward carrier production. Within 2 years, the U.S. would field over 24 new fleet carriers, dwarfing Japan's rebuilt force. Midway had proven what radar, code breaking, and long-range aviation could achieve when combined with courage and coordination. It was not just a tactical victory, it was a technological revolution. The Pacific had become a laboratory of modern warfare, and America had just mastered its most powerful weapon. Culturally, the battle also reshaped perceptions of the enemy. For the first 6 months of the war, Americans had viewed Japanese forces as unstoppable, cunning, fearless, and almost mechanical in their precision. Midway shattered that myth. It revealed that Japan's power, though immense, was human, subject to misjudgment, hesitation, and overconfidence. And for the Japanese public, who were told only fragments of the truth, the shock came later in waves. Families waited for letters that never came. Training squadrons grew silent as names were quietly erased from the rolls. Officers began to speak of honorable defeat, a phrase that had no place in imperial rhetoric before Midway. It was as though the empire had lost more than ships and men. It had lost the illusion of destiny. In America, the victory became legend. Hollywood and newsreels romanticized it as divine retribution for Pearl Harbor. The pilots who survived became national heroes, though most never considered themselves as such. They spoke instead of luck of wind, timing, and fate. Behind the celebration, however, the U.S. Navy learned a quieter lesson. The cost of victory was always blood. The Pacific would demand much more of it before it was done. Midway did not end the war, it redirected it. From that point forward, every island, every beachhead, every carrier launched from an American port would trace its lineage back to that June morning when a handful of pilots, flying into impossible odds, changed the course of history. By the end of 1942, the Pacific was no longer Japan's ocean. It belonged to the carriers and to the idea that air power, intelligence, and courage combined could outthink even the most disciplined of enemies. The floating barns had become the future of warfare, and their wake stretched from Midway to the shores of Japan itself. In the quiet aftermath of Midway, the Pacific once again looked endless, serene, blue, and eternal. But beneath its calm surface lay the graves of men and machines that had rewritten history. Midway was more than a battle. It was a revelation, a moment when chance, intelligence, and courage intersected to alter the fate of nations. For Japan, it was the first crack in an empire built on invincibility. The defeat forced its leaders to confront the limits of pride and power. The men who had once laughed at floating barns learned, in fire and smoke, that technology and adaptability mattered more than tradition. Their confidence had been absolute, and it became their undoing. For America, Midway was rebirth. The sting of Pearl Harbor was still fresh, but this victory proved that courage and strategy could outweigh surprise and fear. It restored faith not only in the Navy, but in the nation's spirit. The lesson was clear. Knowledge and preparation could be just as lethal as guns and bombs. The pilots who fought there, American and Japanese alike, were barely older than boys. Many of them died never knowing how profoundly their actions would shape the century to come. They did not fight for legend or glory or ideology. They fought for duty, for survival, for the men beside them. Their courage turned an empty speck of coral in the Pacific into sacred ground. In the decades that followed, admirals, historians, and soldiers would study Midway as a textbook in leadership and chance. They would marvel at how a handful of decisions, a delayed scout plane, a rearming order, a codebreaker's intuition determined the fate of millions. But beneath every tactical analysis lies a simpler truth. Midway was proof that even in the machinery of war, human will remains the ultimate weapon. When the sun sets over the Pacific today, it touches the same horizon where those ships once burned. And in that fading light, the echoes of Midway endure not as a victory of one nation over another, but as a timeless reminder of how courage and clarity can change the course of the world.